Okay, we will now move to item 4.5. No, we're not, Valerie?
Shortly,
Shortly, okay.
very shortly.
All right,
I just have a short comment.
Okay.
Couple comments. So good morning, good afternoon, almost. I'm here this morning to let you know that this will be my last board meeting.
Oh, no.
Many of you know that I was out earlier at the beginning of the year with some health issues. And those issues have really prevented me from performing in this position as is most desired by me, and certainly by everyone, I think. So I wanted to let you know that I certainly have enjoyed being a part of the team that supports community college students. We have a wonderful, wonderful charge here. And, you know, it's a population where, yes, we want to train them to go to four-year institutions or get a better job. I also hope that we are able to train them to be dreamers, to dream something much bigger than just that. Because certainly a lot of people are going to feel very happy about being able to be first generation in college, being able to get a job. Others simply aren't going to be motivated by telling them, oh, you can get a better job. I think for our community college students, it's wonderful to offer them the opportunity to dream just as big or bigger as students anywhere else in the world, because we are dealing in a global world at this point. You know, at the same time, I would say that we have had, Marlene and I had what I consider one of the most wonderful kumbaya moments yesterday. And kumbaya is come by here. And we did certainly have a wonderful spirit, I think, come by. And the Chancellor and I had an extraordinary conversation last Thursday. And I think there are certain issues where we will always maybe have a few differences, but at the end of the day, we're in good places. I think the majority of the issues have to do with the challenges of anybody being in a position accountable for Washington, D.C., but being based here in Sacramento. And some of you know that I have said that before. As I move forward, I believe that I will continue advocacy, and this time probably advocacy on many of my own issues, including health issues. So I would say that as I leave, if there have been any of you that I've frustrated or disappointed or hurt, I'll say in the tradition of my religious and cultural background, which says, charge it to my head and not to my heart. God is not finished with me yet. So I say goodbye. Thank you very much, and may your God bless you.
thank you very much. We wish you well, Valerie. If we could now move on to item 4.5, our biannual report on distance education. Vice Chancellor Russell and your team.
Good morning, Mr. President and the Board of Governors members. And first of all, I want to thank you very much for moving this to today to accommodate my schedule for being out yesterday.
Sure.
Make sure that
Sorry about that.
you can hear me.
Thanks. Thank you.
This is a report that comes around on a regular basis. And I would just want to let you know there are two reports that we've been working on in academic affairs, this one on distance ed, and in your July meeting, you'll hear one on the library learning resources that will be updating you on the state of those systems in California, community colleges as well. So we're just trying to keep you informed of exactly what's going on in those various systems. And I do want to recognize LeBaron Woodyard here, who has been a long time member of the staff here at the Chancellor's Office, and he is working hard on pulling these reports together and has a lot of this information at his fingertips. So as we get to questions, he will help fill in some of the blanks as we go along. Okay. There we go. Just to, and I'll go through some of these rather quickly. You do have the report, obviously, gives you the full background. The slides give you just a quick overview, but just wanted to make sure that we took the source of the information from three basic areas. We have the MIS data system that collects all the data on all of our students and courses. We had a survey that was sent out, a W survey, something that LeBaron worked on a great deal with all of the colleges to get feedback on why students, when they drop distance ed courses, some feedback on those issues. And then also we do a survey to all of our distance ed coordinators throughout the state every year. And so we wanted to bring that information. That information informs the report. And then just to kind of give you a clear understanding of the types of instruction that we consider to be distance education. It is a broad definition, and basically there are two kinds, the synchronous and asynchronous. And just to use that with the synchronous, the student and the faculty member are in the same place or viewing the same thing at the same time, having the same discussion. It's similar to a regular classroom, but it would just be delivered through an electronic format. And asynchronous would be one in which the student and the faculty member are operating at different times and places. And the learning is going on continuously, probably more on a 24/7 sort of schedule. And so this, we're going to give you a few slides of numbers here to just give you a kind of a volume check on the information that you have. Now, the key point here is these are the number of sessions. We count classes in a couple of different ways, courses, sections, sessions, and these are basically just discrete meeting times for students that are focused on distance ed. And as you can see over the years, the main thing to see here is that there has been an increase every year in the amount of distance ed related to traditional education classes. So we keep expanding that percentage of distance ed classes across the state.
Just so I understand that, if a 12-week class meets twice a week, it's 24 sessions? Is that how you're counting that? What is a session?
Okay, if a session is really kind of a discrete meeting. So you think of a lecture that's divided into a lab. So you may have a lecture session, and then you could have two different lab sessions. Your lecture could have more students, and you could break down your lab sessions into.
So one class could have 3 sessions. If
This is
what
true.
you're saying.
Correct.
Right.
That
Most
would count for one semester.
Well, that would count as one section of a course.
Right.
So the three designations, and it's listed in the report, is a course, a section, and a session. So you would break your sections into various sessions for different purposes. Most sections and sections are equal to each other. It's only when you get into the lab situation, or in the case of a hybrid course, where a portion is done face-to-face and a portion is done at a distance, then you would have two sessions, one as a face-to-face session, one as a distance
I
session.
just want to make sure, because I
Right,
hadn't.
sure, no problem.
And I think it's fair to say that the majority of classes, the section and the session would be the same.
Right.
But there are a few cases where you have to split them up because they get reported in different ways.
And this method allows us to catch everything.
So this is just another graphic to kind of give you the same rise in sessions that have been offered. And you'll see kind of a leveling off in the last couple of years, which we get to in actually in another slide. So I'm going to move on to also give you that that in 95, 96, there were actually 79% of the DE classes were actually through some sort of televised process. So we've had a huge change in about 15 years of technology. That we've moved now, as you can see, to 89% is through some sort of online. And the television piece is actually relatively small. And then we also have a correspondence. There are a few schools that focus in correspondence. One of the key users of the correspondence format would be those that have prison programs, because that tends to be I guess the preferred mechanism of instructional delivery to those populations.
Sure. This next slide addresses, as the previous one talked about, the percentages of course sessions, and you saw we were at about 9% of all of the course sessions. This is the unduplicated student head count. These are the students who have taken at least one distance education course in the system, and we're at about 23.5 or 24%, one out of every 4 students. So more students are taking distance ed courses. About 80% of the students who take a distance ed course is also taking a face-to-face course. So only around 20% is just doing it completely via distance education. So, and these numbers are growing increasingly as well. So the expectation is over the next few years that more students will begin to take this at a greater number, as well as more sessions will increase. Okay, yes. This is also, and we've talked about this in other forums in terms of the impact of the budget on traditional education as well as on distance education. This slide will show you that for the first 4 years, this is a percent change. Distance education was growing significantly, as well as, but traditional education was growing slowly. And this is for data for 9-10. This is not 10-11 data. This is last year, and the greatest impact of the budget was a reduction in the traditional sessions. So you saw traditional sessions go down, but distance education, it slowed. It didn't grow as fast, but it still continued to grow. So this is a demonstration of the impact of distance education in a comparison to traditional sessions and where we may be going in the future. So next year, when we get the data for this year, we'll see if that trend has continued. You heard the chancellor talk about the number of students that we've lost. This is a reflection in the number of traditional course sessions as well.
Okay, one of the other areas that is important for us to understand is that this move to distance education course by course sometimes leads to the actual offering of degree programs, certificates and programs that are fully online or the majority online. And this actually links up with the accreditation standards, which state that colleges must identify programs that can be obtained by more than 50% in a distance ed course pattern, that there has to be a substantive change and a separate approval through the accrediting commission to make that happen. And so colleges now, as they move towards that, are having to go back to the accrediting commission to get those substantive changes in there. And that's happening actually. I've been looking at the past accrediting discussions, and every meeting there tend to be 10 or 15 more added to the docket every year. So that's a growing number. We wanted to give some information about that, and according to our data, about 45 colleges currently offer those programs with 113 different degrees. Associate of Arts degrees, and then 95 Associate of Science degrees, and then another set of certificates. So across the state, 449 degrees and certificates can be had by distance education. So we are moving that direction across the state, and as was alluded to earlier, the federal government now is having a discussion about having some sort of control nationally on the way that that is done. We're responding to that and working with the colleges and trying to make sure that happens, but in a more orderly fashion, as some of these programs do include enrollment from students outside the state. And so that's where we start having to respond to the federal government on those issues.
And I would just point out in your report, Appendix J gives you a chart of which states and how they're impacted on the state authorization issue that the gentleman that presented before us talked about. There is a section where we discuss state authorization and some of the challenges that are being impacted by that. So if you want to look at Appendix J, you can see how certain states, whether it would be easy to participate for a college or difficult. So some work by the WICHE Cooperative Educational Technologies helped in that area.
One of the other areas I wanted to point out, and this topic actually should have more research done on it. We're giving you just a preliminary one data element sort of look at this, but actually I think we need some more research studies, maybe some research with the Academic Senate as well, to look at this issue. And it has to do with the retention of students in the distance education programs. It does appear at a first glance that there is a difference in the retention of students in distance ed courses as opposed to traditional level courses. And that in some ways translates to cost. And so when you multiply those costs over years, that's one of the areas that we think we need to look at closely. How can we better prepare faculty, better prepare institutions, better prepare students for distance education programs and courses? Many times students who think they're adept at using their cell phones, using their iPhone, and communicating with their friends electronically, make the assumption that attending a class through distance ed would be very easy to do, and sometimes have the misguided notion that it's an easier class. When in fact, I think most faculty, most students, in fact, would tell you that a distance ed class in some ways is much more difficult because you have to be more self-motivated to make that happen. So along with the retention strategies, the retention issues, we need to look at retention strategies. And so I think here the Student Services group and Linda's group over in Student Services, as well as Academic Affairs, have been looking at ways that we can cooperate. And here's just a short list of activities that we see as very effective when you talk about distance ed. And this information does come from the survey that we did with the distance ed coordinators, who then they identified from their position that these things seem to make a difference with students who are enrolling in these programs. So we would suggest that we look further at these to see if there are ways to encourage these activities on our campuses.
Vice Chancellor Russell, would you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
And explain the second thing there? I don't know quite what that says, and maybe some other people understood it, but what does that mean? 0.16 FTEs. I mean, I'm not sure what that means.
I'd be more than happy to. As a matter of fact, this is really a critical point. If you were to take a look at the comparison at that 7% gap between a traditional course and a distance ed course, and do a class that had 25 students that were a distance education course in a class that had 25 students that were a face-to-face course. That 7% gap would translate into a 0.16 FTES difference in terms of the number of withdrawals that would come out of that. That difference then aggregates on an FTES basis to $726.40. To give you a larger number, we had 133,000 FTES that was generated by distance education in 2009-10. 7% more W's in a distance ed course would mean about 9,343 FTES difference that would be lost there. And if you do that times FTES, you're talking about $42.5 million difference in terms of the retention of distance education compared to traditional courses.
But we are reimbursed the same amount.
Oh, yeah, no, it's not a loss to the college. It's not a loss to the college.
I understand.
But it's a loss to the state of California.
Yeah,
because they're paying for
I
the
understand. Now, there's one point I think all of us know, and I'll just say it, it's an obvious thing. One reason there's a higher withdrawal rate from distance ed is that it doesn't have the regularity. In other words, if I sign up for a course and I'm supposed to be there at 9 o'clock on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday,
Right.
then I tend to do that. But if I have to choose when I do it, like I do in distance ed, then it's I can procrastinate a little bit. Well, I'm tied up at 9 o'clock. I'll get around to it this afternoon,
Right.
and then before you know it, 3 or 4 weeks have gone by and you've let it slip. I mean, that's the reason why people don't finish a dissertation.
Right, no, you're
They're able to take all the classes, but when you do a dissertation, you're on your own time, and it's distance ed just calls for greater self-discipline.
No, you're absolutely correct. When one of the surveys that we did that we referenced, that Dr. Russell referenced earlier, was the W survey. We sent 56 colleges participated in a W survey, half of the system, and there were about 50,000 students that dropped a distance ed course. And we surveyed those students. We got about a 20% response. These numbers are in the study. The number one reason why students would take a course while they drop the course, and these are reflected in some of the tables here, is exactly what you said. They get behind. They can't get caught up. So some of the things that colleges do, for instance, one retention strategy is called predictive analytics, where they have a software program that's riding on top of the course management system. And if you don't log in for the first 2 weeks because you're procrastinating, you're going to get to it when you get to it, that triggers an alert. Someone contacts you, says, Jack, why haven't you logged in for 2 weeks? And, is something going on? So, but you have to be able to respond. You have to have these types of programs in place And more importantly, which is one of the reasons why we work with the colleges to even do the survey, you need to know why. We can speculate why, but when you have data that can point to certain areas, then you can develop interventions around that. And in order to close that gap, if we want to just have it be equal to the same, we need to invest in these retention strategies over time.
Member Baca has a question.
Well, I don't know if it's a question, but just a comment and follow-up comment on Chancellor Scott's comments. I've been teaching online for a number of years, and I guess what I have to do, because I do require that my students report to me within the first week, prior to the first week. So I guess I should tell them, report to me on Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Is that it? It might work. The biggest number of students that I lose are those that never show up. I mean, that's consistent with what you're saying, that time passes, doesn't happen, and I don't know what becomes of them.
Right.
This is fairly routine.
Right.
I know that 10, 15, just not ever gonna show up, report to in at all.
And I think that points to many of the data points that are discussed in the document. We just need to do more research and more discussion, and hopefully the Student Success Task Force, another item of discussion will be, you know, the proliferation of online and how we can make that more successful. So, okay, there we go. One of the issues that has come up before is the trying to figure out the cost effectiveness of distance education. We have not undertaken, and basically due to just a lack of staff and time to be able to focus on this. But it would be interesting to look at this at some point. We did some research, LeBaron did the research, about the two methodologies that are used to make this happen. So we provided you the information on there with just the caveat that we don't have any specific data tied to California at this point. But we do feel like that we should use one of these methodologies or possibly choose a third methodology to establish this. In just general discussions with faculty and administrators across the state, I think there's an indication that in some ways the level of support, the level of technology that's needed, and the cost of that technology is, when you balance things out, there probably is no major cost savings as going online or going through distance ed as to a traditional classroom, because what you give up, I mean, the classroom space and buildings are already there, so that's not necessarily additional costs. But the technology and the amount of technology that is needed more and more in the classrooms to keep up with the online education is costing more and more as well. So there's this balancing. So in my discussions with many of the CIOs and CEOs across the state is that there probably isn't really any appreciable difference in the cost of those deliveries. But we still need to get pencil and paper out and do some analysis to make those statements. One group, we did have this year a list of distance education statements that came from the LAO's office. And so in the document, we did want to respond to those, make you aware of those that are there. Mostly, I would say, the comments were focused towards higher education as a whole. So they were looking at UC, CSU, and the community colleges together. I will say that community colleges are in the leadership role when you look at distance ed among those three segments. Although distance ed does occur in the UC and CSU, they're not as often held classes as they are in the community colleges. And in fact, many times the faculty from those units ask us for support and help in trying to figure out how to deliver distance ed to a large number of students. And there are some specific things. The definition of distance education is something that there is legislation now occurring in response to this recommendation, and we are moving forward with trying to help identify those. We do have it defined in our Title V regulations. You have defined it, and we have no problem with defining it. It's just needing to be clear about that across the different segments.
Vice Chancellor, I'm going to ask that you speed up a little bit because I want to leave enough time for board members to have some discussion with you and the dean.
Sure. And then the last one that I wanted to bring up here is their recommendation about the Western Governors University. There have been lots of questions about that. So in the document, we did provide more of an explanation of who Western Governors University is and what they do. The main thing to identify the difference between Western Governors University and other sorts of universities is that the way that they measure and assess students' knowledge is by taking some sort of level of competency in a course. And so when you sign up for a course, it's based, your success in that course is based on competency. So for some students, you may take the course and you're able to identify that competency in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. For some students, they may be able to take the course and identify the competency over a period of 12 weeks. So it's a totally different kind of education system. I kind of in my simple way of equate it to how the UC system has UC Santa Cruz, who has a competency-based, a different way of grading the students than the rest of the system does. And so Western Governors kind of does that. And then there's a whole nother layer of how they operate as well. And then the last thing that we wanted to move forward with are the recommendations. And this is something new for us in these reports, is to actually provide these recommendations or comments about where the staff feels like we need to spend some time pursuing more information or having more discussion. The first one is a distance education technology fee, which is now not allowed in our fee handbook. But it may be one of those areas that we need to look at, and I know that fees are something that a lot of people are opposing, and they seem to be popping up now as we look at tight budgets. But I think it would be something that we should look at and have a discussion about. We think that we need to bring back some separate funding. We used to have funding for instructional improvement, so that colleges can keep up with the technology. That's been erased from the budgets in the past. We feel like we need to move that back into the system somehow. We need to identify educational pathways for students, do a better job of doing that, and making sure that we are coordinated with the accreditation process in that. And then student authentication policies is, as was alluded to earlier, and the federal government is becoming more and more important, and identifying that the student taking the class is actually the student who signed up for the class is an important thing. And then academic integrity with distance education and our partners with the Academic Senate. Partnership with Academic Senate on this issue. They've written some great articles about this issue, and we need to focus more attention on that. And then the accreditation requirements are important, and then also self-assessment or an audit of student services related specifically to distance education, very similar to how colleges assess themselves on basic skills at one point. Doing the same thing with distance ed might help us move forward with helping students be successful.
Thank you. Member comments, Member Azumi, Member Palm, and then Member Thomas.
Well, first of all, I want to thank both Vice Chancellor Russell and Dean Woodyard for producing such a complete and thorough and very, very informative report. And I know it's taken a long time, and I want to thank certainly Dean Woodyard, who's reached out to a number of people on the board to solicit their input and advice. And so, we've known about the process of putting the report together. So we really appreciate that, that outreach during the inter-meeting period. So thank you very much for that. I also want to, compliment Vice President Perez for her continued leadership on this issue throughout the many years that I've been on this board on this issue of distance learning. I think that one of the reasons why we have this report is because of her constant vigilance on this issue. So I appreciate that. I want to just say that I had a couple of quick questions. I would say that in my own research that I've done on K-12 on distance learning, that I think that the Chancellor is correct that amongst K-12 providers, they will even tell you that one of the variables that they have in terms of the students and their success in a digital learning situation is the motivation of the student. Mm-hmm. And that they will say that distance learning is not for everybody, because a lot of it depends on how motivated the student is to take advantage of all the benefits that can accrue from distance learning. That having been said, I just want to ask quickly about how, just your general thoughts about how the increase in distance learning over the last few years, as you've indicated, how that may have some kind of effect on the whole issue of impacted courses that we're seeing, throughout the system. And secondly, when you cite the LAO study, they do talk about some cost savings in terms of facilities, but they seem to be focusing on the prospective costs of facilities in the future, and there may not be quite as much need for them if there's a large increase in the distance learning. I just want to know your comments about that. Right.
Well, the first issue with the now I'm forgetting what the first issue was.
Oh, about the impacted classes.
Impacted classes, right. Sorry. The impacted classes, it's as you do enrollment management and as the CIOs and the department chairs and everybody works on the campus to fill this, it has been an ongoing discussion, and I don't know that I have any sort of solution to paint out there other than just it's very important for campuses to continue to have their discussions among themselves about the proper class size, the proper methodology that's being used. I think the challenge is where you might be restricted in a classroom setting to 25 seats that are in the class. In an online setting, you don't necessarily have that same restriction. And the temptation may be, well, let's just push it up to 50 and push it up to 60. And I think any faculty member who is teaching online or who has taught online will tell you that it becomes exponentially more difficult the number of students that you have in a class. So I think I would be very careful to try to push the increased enrollment into distance ed on the back of distance ed and on the back of faculty who are teaching distance ed classes, because the challenges get more the higher the number in the class. And just keeping up with and however the faculty member is keeping up with the students by tweeting them or emailing them or Facebook, whatever method they use, it just becomes mind-boggling at a certain level. So I think that is something that I always counsel the CIOs and the department chairs and deans to take into account when they push that sort of enrollment. And then the facilities question with the LAO's office, and I think you're right that he's looking at building out larger buildings. Also, I think in his numbers, he does pull in the community college, UC, and CSU kind of in the same bailiwick. And so I think some of that discussion about facilities and future build-out is targeted not necessarily community colleges, but to the UC and CSU. I do think these things go hand in hand, and we just need to be careful how we push them out in the future.
Thank you. Member Baum, then Member Thomas.
I just wanted to find out which of these recommendations require legislative action and which of them can we work through our coordinating bodies.
Well, obviously, number 2 would be more money, which is our pie in the sky sort of recommendation. Yes, number 1 would require some sort of legislation or action to change, and then many of the others are more internal activities that we can deal with as a system.
So then the process would be you'd work through the consultation council, then ultimately bring something back to the Board of Governors for action.
Right, we would work through there is an Education Technology Advisory Committee, ETAC, and then Patrick has TTAC.
Right.
And then we have
Do they ultimately all come up back to the Board of Governors for?
But they would all come to consultation, and back, if they required action through Title V change or something, they would come back to the Board of Governors.
Okay.
Right.
Member Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you both for your efforts on such a thorough report. I haven't gotten all the way through it, and I apologize if the answer to my question is in here, but maybe you can point me in the right direction if it is. Based on the comment that our previous presenter made regarding out-of-state distance ed, do you have any sense of what the percentage of out-of-state or out-of-country students we might have in our distance ed program?
Wow, that's a
I don't think, Patrick, I don't know if you have any idea.
Not offhand, but run it.
Yeah, right. I mean, but we haven't asked for that data to be run in our, when we've made the data analysis request, but it is doable.
I'm just curious, based on the comment of the possibility of licensure issues or something like that, wondering what the scope of that impact might be.
Right.
Chancellor Scott, I think, can.
There are 2 colleges that I know of who have a huge military program. They run it through contract education. That is, the military pays for that.
Right.
San Diego has, I believe, 140,000. And Coastline has a very large military program. So that's going to, even though we don't charge them, I mean, we charge them out-of-state tuition, or in other words, we say to the military, we will handle, let's say, 100,000 at this fee, and it's self-supporting. But that would be pretty difficult to get, to have to go through and try to figure out where all those military people are stationed, and to get agreement from, say, somebody who's in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, if that's where it is, or South Carolina, I don't remember where it is. But anyway, I'm just saying, some of that's going to be pretty, it's going to be a burden, I'll put it that way, because those are 2 great programs. And then I assume, I don't know, but if, say, somebody from Arizona wants to take a course, don't they have to pay out-of-state tuition if they take a distance ed course? Mm-hmm. So, you know, they may hear about a course that's being offered over at, we'll say, Orange Coast College or Sacramento City College, and they might take the course. And so, but we do have, I do know we have those 2 big military programs, which frankly are financially helpful to those colleges, because I think they operate them, you know, in other words, the cost is not equal to the revenue that they receive from them, so they are able to make a profit off the courses.
Right.
state-
It just seems as though if there's something that comes down the road requiring a license, and that our colleges might have to get a license in, 50 states or whatever to accommodate the programs you were speaking of, potentially maybe there's a military waiver or something, but it just seemed like that might be an issue.
Right. No, state authorization has sent ripples through the higher education community. Before October, even though the Higher Education Authorization Act of 2008 was passed in August of the previous year, of 2009, it wasn't until October of 2010 that this whole state authorization issue kind of popped up, and it caught a lot of people off guard. And that was supposed to be implemented as of July 1 of 2011. I mean, it caused such an uproar that 16 U.S. senators signed a common letter to the U.S. Department of Education asking for some relief of that. And it wasn't until just a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. Department of Education sent out a second Dear Colleague letter, which is how they kind of communicate to the field, that they were relaxing, not eliminating it, but giving colleges another year to become compliant to July 1 of 2012. But colleges were really, and I've seen colleges in other states that are actually hiring people, creating positions to do exclusively that, identify what's required and file after they identify. And I've had some colleges ask the question, can we just not enroll people? In other words, if I've just got 2 or 3 people outside of my state, can I deny enrollment to those students? So that if it's going to cost me $40,000 to get a license in one state, but I'm losing $35,000 because I'm not making any money off of this student. So these are challenges that colleges are grappling with, and there are some waivers that might be involved with military. I'm not very specific with that, but I know that there are some exemptions in the law, as with any particular law. But so this is going to create some problems for sure.
Vice President Perez and Member Ramos.
I just want to thank you for doing a very comprehensive report, and particularly offering the board members some recommendations aligned with that report. And I think, we would all agree that distance ed is not for all students, but it does serve a large population of students, particularly young females are seeking this type of education. I can tell you from personal experience, my daughter-in-law primarily got her associate's degree through distant ed in the community college system. She's now finishing up her degree at Sac State. This is her last semester there. So I know there is definitely a need here, and as I continue to talk with these younger people, because they're so technology savvy, they obviously want this as a delivery channel. And it's not for all, but I think we need to be conscious of that. I think the other thing is that in a global competitive environment, there are several colleges out there today that are very successful with this model of distant education. They have a lot of best practices in place. It's very cost effective for us. And I would recommend staff that when you're looking at these additional things that we're talking about, that we also look at those models, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If there's best practices already out there that are in place today, let's look at those best practices. But I think also importantly is analyzing what are they doing differently than what we're doing. And I think some of those recommendations that come back to us should be based on best practices of what others are doing today. The other thing I would say is I have had some discussions with CSU, and they do have a concentrated focus on distant ed. They actually have some folks dedicated to expanding their program, because they do see this as a competitive advantage, and they realize that they will continue to lose students if they don't compete in this environment. And I know today it's kind of funny to make a statement about competitive advantage when we're overburdening with students that want to get into our system, but I just think the reality is we need to make sure that we're providing the channels of services to serve the students' needs in the way that students learn best. I would just recommend that the board support the recommendations of staff to allow them to move forward with the recommendations that they laid out for us. Thank you.
Member Ramos.
Yeah, I want to actually piggyback on Member Perez's insights. I'm also a fan of looking at extant best practices and, economically trying to bring them in where we can and adopt them. And on that point, I'm just a little confused about where these retention strategies that have been identified, given the import of that issue, would align with the recommendations, because these seem to me to be very much in the spirit of best practices which have been identified. And I can't really, maybe you can help me sort of figure out, is there a recommendation that would draw on this really rich field of potential applications on the recommendations charter? Could we
Yes.
encourage you to make that a standalone recommendation, to work with our campuses and districts to be sure that there are some standards along these lines that they employ as they introduce these programs?
Right, in the report itself, actually, recommendations 1 and 2 are very retention strategy oriented. We don't provide the detail here, but in some of the discussion, we talk about the feasibility of looking at a distance education technology fee. So if you had a distance education technology fee, one of the things that, at least from a staff perspective, that we would recommend is that if such a fee were to be created, if we were to do a feasibility, say, yes, this is something we could do, that fee would be used to, for retention efforts. In other words, if you were to assign a fee, the fee stays at the campus. That money then goes back into supporting the campus's effort to reduce retention. The Fund for Instructional Improvement, which was created in 1979 and was funded through 2005, it still exists in statute. It just hasn't been funded. And it used to be funded at about $1 million a year. So that recommendation says, let's put $1 million into the Fund for Instructional Improvement, do it for 5 years, $5 million, use that to close the retention gap. I cited a number of $42 million. If that gap was closed in 2009-10, that's how much money the state of California wouldn't have to pay for a W. It would be a completion grade as opposed to a W grade. That student wouldn't need to come back in and take the course again. Yesterday we talked about repeatability and W's and how many students come back and take courses again. So if you invest $5 million over 5 years, if you can close that gap to zero, then you're actually saving the state of California money, and that money can be used for other purposes in terms of students. So those two things, so the Fund for Instructional Improvement, we would say, put that money in and let's use that money for grants to colleges, either individual colleges or regional grants that could be directed exclusively towards retention efforts. It's very important, I think, from not just a fiscal standpoint, but academic challenges. If a student gets a W, that means that in order to get credit for that course, they got to take it again. If they stay in the course and get a passing grade, then they'll just close that one step closer to their academic goal.
Correct. But what I'm interested in is the specificity of these retention strategies being specifically attached to that kind of a general policy. I mean, to me, that's the combination that will ensure that it's not just the sort of framework that we're establishing for success, but we're actually filling that framework in with something that the campuses are really being incentivized to standardize across the system, so we can ensure that the opportunity is actually seized, used, and we're better off for
Right, but
it.
as Vice Chancellor Russell said, these are staff recommendations. I mean, they have it. I mean, we're involved with the academic senate, we're involved with the technology groups and what have you, but these are things that do need to be discussed in a broader context where these kinds of recommendations can get down to that level of detail. So it wasn't within our purview to go too detailed out there, but to allow the system the opportunity to have that discussion.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the information. I think you're on the right track. I'm just saying that as we engage in the conversation, if we could work with you to drill down on more concrete ways to actually take those general recommendations and turn them into practices that will likely lead to more success in this area, I think we will be better served. So your mission is accomplished, and now we have some work to do with you, I think, to take it to the next level.
Thank you.
Member Izumi?
Just a quick follow-up question. When looking at the report, which subjects are more prone to be used, is distance education more prone to be employed? I just asked because I know that when we talk about success/retention, I know that in the K-12 level, you tend to have more success, let's say, in English than in mathematics. I mean, if you look at the virtual schools here in California that, and their test scores at the K-12 level, their test scores in math tend to be lower than in English. And I was wondering whether there was something similar in terms of, the statistics at the community college level.
Well, we do have those. We did not do a run on that. I mean, that is something that we can do. I can say in general, from a distance ed course, you're going to get more core type of courses versus very few activity type courses or PE courses, obviously. And as Vice Chancellor Russell has pointed out, some of these numbers are very broad numbers where we lump everything in. So some of the further research that we want to do and need to do, as a matter of fact, is to be able to pull those out. So we're really looking at apples to apples. What's the retention rate in a face-to-face English course, and what's the retention rate for face-to-face DE courses? So we can drill down to a more equitable comparison. This is very high level. I mean, we could take a whole board session to talk about this, but I know that's not what you want to do now, for sure.
Thank you.
Besides, I want to get on the road too.
All right. Patrick?
Actually,
Oh, thank you, Patrick. Date of mark, right.
okay, top FTES generators, distance ed top codes. Number 1, social sciences. Number 2, business and management. Number 3, humanities. Number 4, infotech. Number 5, math. Fine and applied arts, psychology, family, computer science, or consumer science, education, public and protective services. So it's a different distribution than the normal math, English, EE at the top.
Yeah. Okay.
So English would probably be grouped under a broader top code, like humanities.
Humanities, letters.
Right.
Okay.
Actually, that's the third.
Thank you all for the report. Let me just ask Steve Bruckman question. Our Vice President mentioned about us endorsing or approving these recommendations. Is that something we would do here? Do we need to notice that?
No, I believe that this report has been presented to you.
Okay.
The board certainly could express its support, endorsement of the report that staff has submitted.
Okay, would you like to do that, Vice President?
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
second that.
Okay, seconded by Member Azumi, a motion to support the report and its recommendations herein. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The motion carries. Thank you for the good work.